Well, hello everybody. Thank you for coming today to this webinar presentation. My name is Stephanie Strike, and I am the Operations Coordinator for the CWRA. And today I'm going to be moderating the webinar. So just a few notes before we begin this presentation. We are recording it. We are recording the presentation, and it will be posted afterwards on the CWRA website and YouTube channel. Everyone who registered will receive a copy of the recording tomorrow in an email. Also, we will be taking questions for this presentation, most likely after our two presenters are finished speaking. If you have any questions or comments at that time, please type them into the questions tab on your control panel. So now I'm going to introduce our two speakers for today. First up, we have Charles Papasodoro presenting on Federal Airborne LiDAR Data Acquisition Guideline version 3.0. Charles is a team leader for NRCAN's National Elevation Data Strategy. He has been part of the team for 5 years and has been involved in the development of various systems and products for the team. As a team leader, he is responsible for managing the LiDAR acquisition and classification contracts, coordinating team tasks, collaborating with federal, provincial, territorial partners, and updating the Federal Airborne LiDAR Data Acquisition Guide. Charles holds a bachelor's degree in applied environmental geomatics and a master's degree in remote sensing from the University of Sherbrooke. Our next presenter is Heather McGrath, who is also presenting with us today. And Heather McGrath is a geospatial scientist with Natural Resources Canada. Before joining NRCAN, she worked in industry with GPS equipment in land and offshore surveying, including collecting and processing multi-beam and bathymetric LiDAR. She completed her PhD at the University of New Brunswick, and her research focus is on developing and applying new approaches to rapid flood mapping and risk assessment to increase awareness of flooding and for communication of flood risk. So thank you to you both for presenting with us today. Charles and Heather, take it away.
Thank you, Stephanie. Can you hear me well and see my screen well also?
No, I think I need to make you the presenter. Oh, you are the presenter. I can't see your slides though.
Okay, I should.
Oh. Sorry, one sec here. Okay. We can see your slides now.
All right.
Yep. Perfect.
All right, so let's go. So hi everybody, welcome to this webinar. So like Stephanie said, we'll be talking about the new version 3.0 of our Federal Airborne LiDAR Data Acquisition Guideline, which was released last December. Before heading into the more deep details on these new guidelines, we thought we'd provide you a bit of context about flood mapping at NRCAN, at the Government of Canada. LiDAR at NRCAN also will be the second section of our webinar today. So without further ado, as you're probably aware, water management and flood mapping is mainly the jurisdiction of provinces and territories in Canada. Nonetheless, the federal government is also involved in flood management efforts and also financial assistance post-disaster. There has been multiple successful programs throughout the last decades, such as the FDRP, which was conducted as joint efforts with the federal and provincial territorial governments. Also, the NDMP program, which is still ongoing, actually helped map at least 133 projects across Canada. The First Nations of that program, still ongoing as well, is a flood mapping is a program that helps flood mapping on reserve in partnership with communities. And another one for which we're really related at NRCAN is the Emergency Management Strategy for Canada. And a couple of our tasks are related to this actually. So NRCAN is really has a focus on flood mapping, and it was really it was stated actually in the mandate letter to work with the Ministry of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness and with the province and territories and Indigenous peoples to complete all flood maps in Canada. Despite this statement in the mandate letter, there's no current funded program for flood mapping yet at NRCAN, but still we have a lot of activities related to flood mapping that are ongoing. Those activities can be divided in 3 pillars, I can say, if I can say, data, activities, and collaboration. Sorry, hearings and feedbacks, okay. And today we'll be talking more about the acquisition of high resolution LiDAR and foundational geospatial data on the data side. And we'll be talking also about publishing guidelines, so the federal LiDAR guidelines in the activities pillar. Regarding the flood mapping framework, which was established in the federal flood mapping guidelines series, data acquisition of LiDAR really is key for the flood mapping framework, and it's fully integrated in this framework. So what are we doing with regards to LiDAR at NRCAN? How do we support actually Government of Canada in LiDAR data? We do a lot of coordinations with provinces and territories in order, for instance, to avoid duplication of acquisitions, maybe to go with pool or combined acquisitions sometimes. We also establish and manage multiple LiDAR contracts, sometimes for NRCAN's funded programs or on behalf of other department programs. For this, to help this, actually, we have a supply arrangement in place with 18 pre-qualified LiDAR vendors. It's really helpful to facilitate. It's really helpful to go faster with RFP and tender, everything like this. So it helps us a lot. We're also responsible for creating and disseminating elevation products, such as the HRDM and the new one, the HRDM Mosaic, that I'll be talking a little bit more in the 2 slides, I think. We also have a LiDAR quality control system that is completely based on the validations that are suggested in the federal LiDAR guideline. And talking about this guideline, we are responsible of managing this guideline. And yeah, all right. So jumping into our in this map here, I was talking about coordinating with provinces. We do a lot of collaboration regarding the LiDAR data. We try to keep a very good understanding of the LiDAR data status over Canada, and that helps us a lot for avoiding duplications of LiDAR. For instance, here what you're seeing is in green are all of the green polygons are actually what LiDAR data is integrated in the federal inventory. So the pale and the dark green, and the beige polygon is actually the provincial license data. And we have discussions on the way with Saskatchewan and British Columbia, as well as Quebec, to integrate this data in our federal LiDAR inventory moving forward. And just so you know, we're near quite a good milestone for our national strategy. We are near 500,000 square kilometers of LiDAR in our federal LiDAR inventory, so it's a very good step forward for the strategy. And about just a quick one about the products. Last December, also we released a new product in our CAN Elevation series, published on Open Maps. It's called the HRDM Mosaic. It's actually it follows the same spatial coverage than the HRDM data, but we don't have any overlapping between LiDAR projects in the HRDM Mosaic. So when there's an overlapping area, we're using the most recent HRDM data and we're disseminating it. So it helps actually to facilitate navigation and interaction with the HRDM data. It's offered through WMS and WCS, so very typical web mapping services protocol. And it also leverages NRCAN's data cube, which is based on some big data, open big data management technologies. So it's available on OpenMaps, totally free. Have a look. Go have a look. And finally, yeah, LiDAR it's really important to note that it's a very important new data source for us. Very important data source for Government of Canada priorities. Here at CCMEO, we're using it to derive several other layers or vector layers, such as the automatically building layers. But it's also very useful to update the National Hydro Network, which can be used also for hydrologic modeling. And for the case that interests us today, it's really a useful tool to useful data, sorry, for hydrological modeling. Now we're jumping in the Federal Airborne LiDAR Guideline 3.0. It's a guideline that's part of the Federal Flood Mapping Guidelines series. All of those guidelines are available on the Public Safety Canada web portal. Just a quick reminder of the guidelines objectives. The first version of it was released in 2017, sorry. But the objectives are really the same, and we're trying to keep it the same way for the objective. So it's promoting a minimum consistent standard for acquisition of LiDAR across the country. It's intended to create an open dialogue between all levels of government and industry. It's intended also to promote a common and consistent vocabulary related to LiDAR acquisition and processing. And finally, it's one of the objectives also is to have a better harmonization of Canada-US border related mapping projects, especially in the context of the 3DEP program from our friends at the United States, sorry. For the guideline structure, there's no really big change with regards to guideline structure in this new version. We're keeping the core components 1 to 6 that are following the typical execution steps of a LiDAR project. The new feature really for this new guideline is the addition of a new topobathymetric LiDAR appendix, which was added. The other appendix are really related to the thematic for LiDAR. So LiDAR for forestry, LiDAR for flood mapping, and this new one is really specific to topobathymetric LiDAR. So the main new features of version 3.0, like I said, new appendix on topobathymetric LiDAR. Another important thing to note is that in the other appendices of the guide, I was talking about forestry, flood mapping, infrastructure, the minimum acquisition specifications, sometimes they were lower than the Canadian quality level 1, so they have been adjusted to meet it. Also, we added indications that the use of satellite-derived PPP correction is allowed, as long as it allows to meet accuracy specifications of your projects. And also for the point cloud classification evaluation, there's a new alternative for evaluating this for larger projects. It's based on samples rather than on the number of points. So today we'll be digging a bit deeper on the airborne topobathymetric LiDAR, which I will sometime recall as TBL in the next couple of slides. So it was developed with the assistance of Dr. Tim Webster, a topobathymetric LiDAR specialist at Nova Scotia Community College. The emphasis is placed on TBL acquisitions for flood applications. So it's really important to note we're not here focusing on bathymetric acquisition for nautical charting or navigation, for instance. It's really related to flood. It's intended to be a recommendation and guideline document for bidding and contracting. The new appendix really presents the bathymetric component of TBL systems and acquisition. For the topographic component of LiDAR acquisitions for flood, we refer to the recommendations from Appendix 2, flood mapping. So, for instance, there's a density and accuracy requirement based on flood risk category for the topographic component. So it's all detailed in Appendix 2. So, long story short, we're focusing on the bathymetric component of TBL acquisitions. We thought it was worth presenting some general principles about TBL. So generally, TBL sensors are equipped with the near infrared laser and the green laser. The pulses are emitted from an aircraft, so from a plane, and the travel time is measured between the aircraft and the land, the water surface, and the seabed. It's really the green laser pulses that allows to have some returns from the bottom of the water, because the green laser has the ability to penetrate the water up to a few meters. When we're considering the water surface height, refraction, and slowing of speed of light in the water, we can obtain bathymetric elevation. Water clarity is really a key factor affecting depth of penetration for TBL, so there's a lot of details in our new appendix regarding water clarity. For flood risk mapping, really there are many benefits to include topobathymetric LiDAR as input for this. So in the hydrodynamic model, for instance, it helps calculate water movement, the speed of the flood water, flood duration. It also allows to better estimate the bed roughness. For instance, the Manning's roughness coefficient, and thus to improve the hydrodynamic modeling. Cross sections also representing the river channel topography are really improved in terms of accuracy using this TBL or bathymetric elevations. And on the coastal regions, bathymetry in shallow water is really essential for modeling storm surge event and wave setup and runup. So those are some of the benefits of topobathymetric LiDAR. Okay, so a bit more detail, technical details here. I won't explain every acquisition parameters, but I'll go in the more important ones. So as for the point density, we recommend asking for at least 2 points per square meter for areas submerged at the time of survey. This will allow to have a good DEM of the areas submerged. With regards to the vertical and horizontal accuracies, we suggest asking for something similar to IHO special order, so the International Hydrographic Organization special order. For the vertical accuracy, it's around 25 centimeters. Another key one here is a flight altitude at 400 meters. This is recommended. For the inland part of your topobathymetric LiDAR, we recommend asking a minimum of 400 meters inland horizontally, starting from the mean low water. So this will help building a very good seamless topobathy product. For the depth of penetration of the LiDAR survey, we recommend asking at least 1.5 times the SECI depth. For coastal areas, you can expect something around 4 to 9 meters of penetration, depending on water clarity. And for some shallow rivers, this could be a bit lower. You can expect something at 2 meters, for instance, for shallow rivers. Next sections of interest in the new appendix is the project planning and collection. So in this section, you'll find much more details on the recommended acquisition parameters, some of them that were presented in the previous slide. In this section, it's also mentioned that the requested density may not be achieved due to certain environmental conditions that cannot be controlled. So we were talking about the 2 points per square meter. For some reason, sometimes because of water clarity, turbidity, this cannot be controlled, but this should be really explained by the contractor at the end in the final report. So it's generally accepted that shallow water TBL sensor are the appropriate sensors for flood risk mapping. For certain projects, you can also combine with deep water sensors if you want to have depth of 2 to 3 times the SECI depth, but you should know that the density will be lower at those depth of penetration. So, like I said a bit earlier, water clarity and turbidity, those are key considerations. So there's a complete subsection on this aspect that's presented in the appendix. And finally, leaf-up acquisition and low water level are to be preferred for performing this TBL acquisition. I'll be quite fast on this one. Data processing and management. A seamless topobathymetric product must be produced. We really recommend this. For the topographic, for the reference systems, we recommend asking the same as the topographic LiDAR one. So the 983 CSRS EPOC 2010, UTM zone, and CGBD 2013 GeoID, which is the Canadian standard currently. And for the point classification, the points onshore should be classified according to classes, typical classes recommended in the guideline. But for the bathymetric areas, we recommend following those classes here from 40 to 45, depending on which point is which. Sorry. The data validation, it is recommended that GNSS checkpoints be acquired on the riverbed or the sea floor, and this will allow to verify if the accuracy of your LiDAR project is met. We were talking about IHO spatial order here. There's no really guidelines on the number or distribution of points, but however, they should be taken for several depth and under varying bottom conditions. And taking those points, it's also important to take into account submerged aquatic vegetation because it can have an impact on the accuracy. And finally, we recommend asking for those typical deliverables, so a project planning report before going on the field, reports that show the progress of the acquisition provided at regular intervals or following acquisition days. We also recommend asking those final deliverables such as classified seamless topobathy LiDAR, a seamless topobathy DEM, a final project report, and also very important to ask for a final footprint showing data coverage with explanation of data gaps. So this will explain, for instance, why you're not able to, the contractor was not able to get 2 points per square meter at some point, or even maybe no points at all. So maybe it's because signal extension, water clarity, but this should be explained in this document as well. So that's about that. That's about this. If you want to have a bit more information on our strategy, we publish a newsletter on the strategy twice a year. If you're interested in receiving it, just contact us at this email there. We should publish a new one, a new newsletter in maybe in a month or so. So a lot of new information on this. So thank you.
Thanks, Charles, for that.
I was just mentioning that should you have any questions that are maybe very technical or more general, anyway, just contact us at this email. Also, we'll answer it back.
Perfect. Thanks, Charles, for that presentation.
Thank you.
I now will turn it over to Heather, and then hopefully we'll be able to have some time for questions at the end.
Great, thanks, Stephanie. Can you hear me all right and see the presentation? Okay, I will assume that is a yes. So thank you very much. I'm going to talk today about our new federal guideline on damage estimation for buildings and infrastructure. This is not as mature of a guideline as Charles presented. This is just version 1, where he was giving us some details about version 3 for the LiDAR. These documents are evergreen and they're intended to kind of get modified and changed as new information comes about. So yeah, version 1 of the Federal Flood Damage Estimation Guidelines for Building and Infrastructure. On our flood mapping framework, we've positioned this document into the risk assessment category. What you see here on the left is a list. In black is all of the guidelines that are currently published and available. And there's 3 in gray that are in progress and should be released later this year. So we'll give you some kind of details about the damage estimation for buildings and infrastructure. So for this guideline, as with all the guidelines, we utilized the knowledge and information from a volunteer technical working group that was formed in 2015 on flood mapping, and it comprises a group of key stakeholders from federal, provincial, and territorial jurisdictions, as well as input from the private sector and academia to contribute to these guideline series. For this particular guideline, we've assembled a sub-working group of specialists in the field of flood risk assessment and damage estimation to provide input, and we used a document called the Canadian Guidelines and Database of Flood Vulnerability Functions that was researched in 2016 as kind of a primary input to this document. And then with this working group of specialists, we made some revisions and modifications to it. So I'll just talk a little bit, since this is our first release of this. The objective of this document was to provide guidance on how to evaluate potential economic losses with the focus on buildings and infrastructure incurred as a result of flooding. And within this objective, we kind of identified 4 specific sub-objectives, I guess, if you will. One, we described the range of flooding hazards that we have across Canada and the factors that can affect flood damage. So we have some different details about the different types of floods that can happen and different factors that affect the damage that can be occurred by a building, be it velocity or debris or things like that. We also described different methods available for estimated damage resulting from flooding, with the focus in this version of primary riverine flooding. We're providing guidance on how to develop and use stage damage curves, as well as considerations on their use, accuracy, and limitations when you're employing them. And provide guidance for future adjustments and regional indexing of these stage damage curves. So the overall focus is mostly on direct and tangible damages of buildings and infrastructure. So for the rest of the presentation, I'll kind of describe some kind of key components from these specific objectives to give you some highlights about what's contained in the document, and then encourage you to dive further into it and read some more details in the document. So with the working group, we developed kind of a small table here of the different types of floodings, and the intent is not to do a comprehensive review of the types of flooding, but rather to point out that various types of floods will produce different types of damage, and the user should be mindful of these differences when developing and working on damage assessments. So you'll have a different kind of economic impact from a coastal storm surge versus maybe an ice jam or just riverine flooding. So there's some more details about each of those. And then we've got some descriptions and lists of different types of factors that affect those damages that may influence or increase the damages occurred from a flood. So a couple key ones that we'll point out is duration. So the longer a flood lasts might have more material damage and also damage to the population and business interruption as well. Velocity, so strong flowing water can cause significant structural damages to buildings and infrastructure. In Canada, we also have ice flooding or ice jams, which can cause significant impact to damages. So this could be from high velocity flooding when an ice jam breaks up, It could be due to the load on substructures such as bridge footings, where there's kind of greater load on those substructures. And then also freezing floodwaters that may cause extra damages to houses in the case of freeze-up jams. And we also pointed out here today the effects of climate change as well. So sea level rise, more intense and frequent severe storms, and then changes in seasonal timing of peak stream flow that may affect the damages that you're estimating on the buildings and infrastructure. And we included a graphic as well, just to kind of highlight that there are a variety of different types of damages that can be computed and estimated based on a flood. We've adapted a graphic that was in the flood damage assessment in Alberta, a best practices guideline from 2015, and kind of added a few extra categories to their initial graphic. So if we look at flood damage as a whole, it can kind of generally be broken up into two primary categories, whether it's tangible or intangible. So in the tangible category, these are financial costs that can be estimated in dollars. And then the intangible are a little harder to assign kind of monetary components. They're more social losses and increased levels of insecurity, and a couple examples there. And then inside each of these tangible and intangible categories, we have three subcategories for direct, indirect, and business interruption. So in the direct, these are damages that would occur immediately and can be directly attributed to flood inundation. And these direct damages can include damage to public infrastructure as well as private property. We've got indirect, which occur as a result of direct flood impacts, but they're more difficult to quantify, and examples may include reduced economic activity, individual financial hardships, adverse impacts on the social well-being of a community. So those are our how we've broken it up. And again, the focus primarily is on the direct tangible losses in this guideline at this stage. So we've provided some recommendations that stage damage curves are a good measure to estimate damage. These are the most common and internationally accepted method for estimating tangible direct damages at urban scales. And it basically provides a relationship between the water depth and the damage to a structure. They may be represented by absolute or relative economic losses, so it may be related to percent damage to a structure, or may have a dollar value associated per each depth, depending on how the curve was created. These can be derived by either empirical or synthetic techniques, depending on the community or the user that's developed them and based on the knowledge that's in the environment for that community. We're making a recommendation that these stage damage curves can be used in both residential and commercial properties, but that residential and commercial properties should have their own unique curves because the building infrastructure and the contents and the construction practices are different between the residential and the commercial, so that they should have their own stage damage relationship. We're also recommending that there should be separate curves for structural and contents damages, so that those can be calculated individually and summed together. And to provide an example, we've just included an example residential stage damage curve for contents to a building. So you can see on the left this schematic showing the inside of a building and the furnishings and the art and furniture and so on. And then on the right is this relationship between water depth and the damage. And because the stage damage curves are relative on the depth of water, we've provided some recommendation on how to reference the first floor height. So we've included a graphic here, and for riverine flooding, we recommended to use the top of the finished flooring, whereas coastal or lake flooding, where velocity is a factor, to use the bottom of the lower floor beam. as your base height. As well, most buildings are not, excuse me, most buildings are not necessarily built on flat terrain, so we're recommending to use the building grade at the highest point as your reference point when you're measuring the height above the first floor. And so we made the recommendation to separate a content damage curve from a structural damage curve. And just to give you some kind of details about what's in each of those. So the content damage curves are items and goods within a residential building. And it's recommended that region-specific curves are developed to reflect the characteristics of your study area. And they should be developed separately for each story between a basement or a main level and a secondary level, as you'll have different damage relationships to depth with each of those levels. And then for the structural damage curves, this contains things like finished and structural elements of the residential buildings, and it may include costs such as cleaning, repair, restoration, removing standing water, sediment, disposal of damaged items, drying, and things like that. And it should be estimated on the basis of current local material and labor costs. And then secondarily, we have the non-residential stage damage curves. So this may include commercial buildings, industrial, agricultural, schools, religious buildings. And again, we've recommended to have the content and the structural damages separately. The contents may include things like inventory in your commercial buildings, or it may include equipment and different types of things that you have inside an industrial building. And then agricultural damages may include damages to crops, soil, equipment, and supplies, and so on and so forth. And depending on the time of year, the agricultural damages may change as well, depending on at what stage they are in the growth of the crops. And so that time of year may be actually a bigger factor than the water depth, depending on the type of crop that you're talking about. We've also included some kind of recommendations or limitations to consider when using these stage damage curves and the confidence in the accuracy of the results. Typically, these damage curves represent a single relationship of water depth to damage. It doesn't always include other damage-inducing parameters such as velocity, debris, contaminants, whether it's fresh or salt water. There are some curves that may be developed that do include these, but it's really good to know some details about the stage damage curves that you're working with in order to see if those are other factors that you should consider. And secondly, they're generally not tailored necessarily to individual buildings. Many of the damage curves that we've seen are aggregations. So you may have several buildings in a community that are evaluated. So you may have maybe 50 buildings that are residential that have a single family living in them and that are one story with a basement. And of those 50 buildings, they may all have slightly different kind of relationships between depth and damage. And often the damage curves that's generated is just an aggregation or a kind of best fit of those similar structures. And we do make a recommendation that generating your own depth damage curve is recommended, though we do realize that projects, timelines, budgets may not account for that. So we've included some recommendations for future adjustments and regional indexing. So with the future adjustments, many of the stage damage curves are developed based on present day dollars. So in Calgary after the 2013 flood, there were several depth damage curves that were generated based on that event. And if we wanted to use those today, we would need to do some adjustments to that 2013 dollars to present day. Our recommendations use a variety of the Statistics Canada's data tables. We utilize the Consumer Price Index, which measures the price and change of an equal basket of goods in the same place at different times. The Survey of Household Spending, and construction price indexes. And there's more details on how to kind of run this calculation and links to those specific tables in the document. And then we also discuss regional indexing. So there might be some damage curves that were developed in Calgary, and maybe you are in Edmonton or another city or Vancouver, and you wanted to take those damage curves and see if they could be applicable in your region. So we provided some recommendations on how to do some regional indexing to kind of convert, if you will, those damage curves from one location to your location. And these provide some recommendations in there on how to calculate this. Though whenever possible, developing curves for your region is ideal or recommended. So we've provided some recommendations on how to adjust the contents damages, again, using Statistics Canada data tables, and allows for these regional price comparisons. And then we can use the spatial price survey to create an index to compare the cost of goods between those different communities. And then again, recommendations for the structural damages as well. And so that's just kind of a high level of kind of the primary contents and details in the document. We also have some other details where we talk about tangible and direct damages, other approaches for estimating tangible direct damages to buildings, some examples from multi-level and below-grade parkades, as well as unique structures. We provide a little bit of detail and guidance on intangible and indirect damages, as well a number of case studies that we found in provinces and cities across the country to provide some additional information. We've got some tools, some data points, as well as some data capture forms that you could use post-event to collect information to develop your own curves. So that brings us back to the overall framework. We should have a link available now for this damage estimation guideline for you to read and review. And with that, I'll say thank you very much for listening. Oh, and if you do have any questions, feel free to reach out.
Thanks, Heather, for that presentation. It was a really interesting. I learned quite a bit from that. And Shala as well, thank you for your presentation. And we have some time now, a few minutes for some questions. So just a reminder to folks, if you want to have a question or want to ask a question to our two presenters, you can just write them in your questions tab, and I will ask them to our presenters. And so whilst we're waiting for our for some questions to come up, I do have one for Heather. And this question is, are there any examples of floods that have been used, or where the stage damage curves have been used in the past?
Yeah, there's quite a few examples. The Calgary one is probably a really good example that from 2013 that stage damage curves were created. We also referenced a report from like the 1980s in Southern Ontario that they used to develop some stage damage curves, but there's not, from our experience and what we found, there's not that many damage curves that have been developed in Canada for Canadian infrastructure. Some users may kind of use some of the US damage curves that have been generated and use some of these regional indexing methods to apply them to their area.
Okay. I do see some questions are coming in now, so let's get to them. One of the questions is, what are the plans and processes for the next upgrades to the damage guidelines? I guess this would be more of a question for Heather, but
yeah, I think that we've got a couple ideas that we identified in the working group as ideas for version 2, but we haven't really thought that far ahead for what we're going to include. So we're open and welcome to any comments or suggestions. Probably include some more details about coastal flooding since there is such a heavy focus on riverine. But yeah, nothing is set yet, so we're open and welcome to suggestions.
And those suggestions, if you were open to them, where would we contact? How would we contact you?
Yeah, you could email myself directly, and I'm not sure if there's a link on the page where the guidelines are. I'll have to double check with that, but yeah, you can certainly forward it to me for the heather.mcgrath@canada.ca.
Great. All right, I have a question here for Charles. The HRDEM is it largely from Arctic DEM?
It's primarily based from Arctic DEM in the north. So we have 1.6 million square kilometer in the north from Arctic DEM, but in the south it's exclusively from LiDAR. But it's not. It could happen also to have HRDM from LiDAR in the north. So we're trying to divide the HRDM in two parts based on the productive forest line, but it's not. I mean, it's not exclusive to have Arctic DM in the north. It could happen moving forward also. Arctic DM from LiDAR in the north. HRDM from LiDAR in the north, sorry.
All right. I have another question here for Charles. Are all pre-qualified vendors for LiDAR vendors, capable of bathymetric LiDAR?
They could be, but we're not. We have not pre-qualified them for this work in particular. We have pre-qualified them for acquisition of LiDAR as well as classification, but also orthophotography acquisition in support of LiDAR. But there's no there's no work related to topobathymetric LiDAR yet.
Okay. The next question is, what kind of information is asked on the data capture forms?
Is it for me or for Heather?
I'm actually not sure, but I think it probably could be answered by both of you.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
I can start, and if you want to think, Charles.
Sure.
Yeah.
So for the data capture forms, we're collecting a lot of information about the building structure, about the type of foundation, the square footage, the number of rooms, as well as the size or the dimensions of rooms, the contents in each room, the placement of furniture, height of windows, height of first floor. So trying to be fairly comprehensive in kind of the structural outline of the building with the breakdown of the rooms as well as the content forms as well. And if there was post-flood, if there were marks or indicators on the walls or the baseboards or something, that would give us an indication of the height of the water in the building.
Thanks, Heather. I'm pretty sure it was intended
Awesome.
for you.
That question actually was for you, Heather.
Okay,
Yeah.
perfect.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Okay, here is another question for Charles. So on your coverage map in your presentation, there was a large part of Northern Ontario that is not covered. Is there an opportunity to work with the MNR on using the LiDAR they are capturing for their EFRIs to expand the NRCAN's elevation database?
That's a very good point. It's one of the major projects that's not on our LiDAR map. Definitely, yes, it's in our cards to see what we can do and how we can integrate this kind of data in our federal LiDAR inventory. But we are not allowed to show it on this map. So it's why it's not on the map actually. But definitely, yes. Well, we're keeping an eye on it.
Great. We have about 5 minutes left before we have to turn over to the next presentation that's being offered in French. So we have a few minutes left for a couple more questions. The next question is, does NRCAN have a platform or tool for applying depth damage curves in flood risk assessments?
I can take that one. We've been working with, at NRCAN, we've been working with IBI Group recently on a tool called CAN Flood, which is an extension to QGIS, so that users can run kind of risk assessments using that tool, and they're able to input their own depth damage curves in order to calculate risk assessments. So I'd say that is one tool that we have been working on to support the application of the depth damage curves. That should be launched in the next month, I think.
Perfect. My next question is for Heather. Does the flood mapping framework take into consideration impacts due to climate change?
We do have a document that has several case studies that deal with climate change considerations. So I'd say that we definitely have that separate as a component as well. There are indicators or references to climate change and how they may impact different things like the damage assessment, as well as our risk assessment guideline that we're working on as well. So we are trying to have that in consideration, and there is a separate standalone document that has several case studies.
Great, awesome, thank you. I have another question here for Charles. How does the cost of gathering, oh, sorry, I missed my question here. How does the cost of gathering topobathymetric data compare to other methods of gathering bathymetric data?
That's a very good question. It's not something that we assessed as part of this appendix, and we're not, we don't have any experience yet on topobathymetric LiDAR at NRCAN. There is certainly a clear benefit of having it as compared to the sometimes poor density that you can have with other methods, or even no density at all in submerged areas. So yeah, there is an analysis to be performed for sure on the cost analysis versus the benefit of it, but we don't have it.
Okay, I have another one for you, Shal. This one here says, my understanding was there was LiDAR flown on the shore of Lake Huron for bathymetry mapping updates. This was not shown on your existing LiDAR coverage map. Was it flown, or is it going to be flown?
The person is probably talking about acquisitions that were done or that are currently being done by the Department of Fishery and Ocean. So those are bathymetric LiDAR. They also have a small topographic inland part, but it's mainly bathymetric. So those are not shown on the map. The map is strictly topographic LiDAR. So yeah, that's it.
Okay. I think we have time for one more quick question. And this one is for Heather. Creating a building inventory for use in CAN Flood is time consuming and expensive. Are there plans to look into methods that can automate some of the processes by using tools such as Google Street View or trolling through the tax assessment data?
Yeah, that's something that we are considering. The work on this first version of CAN Flood is coming to an end, and we're trying to determine what we could do to make it more useful, and that is one of the considerations that we're looking at to implement for future work in a new version. So yeah, we do recognize that that is a time-consuming process, and trying to think of how we could help speed that up and streamline it a little bit more. So yes, that is definitely something that we are considering and trying to figure out how to move forward with.
Perfect. With that, we are out of time. So I would like to thank both Heather and Shal for their presentations today. on behalf of the CWRA. They were super interesting. And if any of our audience members have more questions, they can email Heather and Charles both. And or get in contact with operations@cwra.org, and we can make sure that your questions are. And before we go, I just wanted to give a small plug for the next CWRA's next webinar for World Water Day, which is going to be on Thursday. It is a panel of presenters that can be found on the CWRA website, with the theme being the value of water. So you can go to the CWRA website /events to find out more about that, the panel and the speakers that will be presenting that day. And with that, I would like to say thank you, and I guess it's time to turn off the webinar.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.